Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 3 Wide. This week the Monster Energy NASCAR Cup Series is at Michigan International Speedway for the Consumers Energy 400. Overall to me this felt like just a very weird race from the start. In the beginning of the race the leader wasn't pulling out to a really huge lead. I think the biggest lead for like the first two stages was maybe 2 seconds, which is pretty decently small for Michigan. But then in the third stage it turned into same old Michigan where the leader would just pull away by a crazy amount of seconds. It had a glimpse of hope of turning into a fuel mileage / strategy race, but in the end it was more the same where Kevin Harvick won this race. So now we'll get into my 3 takeaways from the Consumers Energy 400. Number 1. Kevin Harvick gets his 7th win of the season. After not leading a lap last week at Watkins Glen, Kevin Harvick had an off race at the Glen. But this week in Michigan, he came back with a vengeance, where he won his 7th race of the season, including both stages. This also upped Kevin Harvick's playoff point count to 40 playoff points, which is 5 more playoff points than Kyle Busch. But Kyle Busch is in the points lead, so Kyle Busch will get those 15 bonus points to go in the playoffs. But doing the math on this, if the playoffs started today, with those 15 bonus points for Kyle Busch, that would get him 50 bonus points for the playoffs, and Kevin Harvick would get a bonus 10 points for finishing in second, but adding to his 40, that'd get him to 50 playoff points, so they would be tied heading into the start of the playoffs. So now we'll see as the season stretches on with only a couple races left till the playoffs start, that maybe these top 2 will be opting more for playoff points instead of later down the road where they would pull off, like let's say at Watkins Glen and Pocono, instead of for track position that the points matter more. Now on to number 2. Strategy kinda worked. With Michigan having a fairly new surface, people were wondering how the tires would wear on the track. Even though the cars are doing upwards of 215 plus miles an hour into turn 1, it seemed that teams felt comfortable leaving the tires on for a lot longer for multiple runs during this race. We saw some pit stops teams would take 2 tires, we saw some stops where teams would take no tires, just fuel only, and we saw 4 tires, which ended up being the move of the race where Kevin Harvick got 4 tires at the end, and he ended up going by Austin Dillon, who only took 2 to get the win. Even though Austin Dillon got passed by Kevin Harvick, the 2 tires was the way to go, and this just has me wondering if later in this race, if guys who are up front with Harvick, like Kyle Busch, if we would be talking about Kyle Busch getting a win at Michigan instead of Harvick. Now on to number 3. Lines mattered. In the past at Michigan, we've seen how restarts have played a huge role into who wins this race. But in today's race at Michigan, it seemed like that bottom line was such garbage that no one could really get it working unless you carried a lot of speed into turn 1 to where you would dive it in a lot further and then you could maybe slide up to get past the guy who got the jump on the top. But then this led getting into the turn, where if you were dead even with the guy next to you, if you were on the bottom, that guy on the top would just go flying by you because the groove in turn 1 was just so narrow. This has me thinking back to Pocono, where you were dead even going into turn 1, the guy who was on the top be able to carry his momentum and go flying by you. One thing that I was surprised about during the race that we really didn't hear any of on the broadcast were that people weren't counting cars coming off the pit road to be an even spot, so this way you wouldn't be stuck on that bottom groove. So now we'll see going on later into this season if this will play a factor at any races. So now with all that being said, we'll put Michigan behind us and get into what to look ahead to next week at Bristol for the night race. Number 1, will the bottom hold? The first time that the Monster Energy NASCAR Cup Series showed up at Bristol this year, Bristol sprayed a bunch of PJ1, the traction compound, down to get the bottom lane to work again and turn it into semi-old Bristol. But as we know with the first race at Bristol, it rained and they only got 204 laps in of the 500 laps and had to come back on Monday. So now if this Bristol night race goes the whole distance, this has me wondering if the PJ1 will hold for the whole 500 laps, or if later in the race the cars will have to migrate to the top to turn this into what Bristol used to be before they started spraying the PJ1 down on the bottom. Now on to number 2, contenders for the big 3. From now on, pretty much at every track that the Cup Series shows up to, everyone's going to say that Kevin Harvick, Kyle Busch, and Martin Truex Jr. would be the ones to beat. This has me wondering going to Bristol who can contend with them and maybe steal a win. 2 people that immediately came to my mind from the first race at Bristol that can maybe contend with the big 3 are Kyle Larson, who finished 2nd and really could have won this race, but he got bumped out of the way at the end, and Jimmy Johnson, who finished 3rd at the first race this time around. And as we've seen out of the Hendrick cars of late, they've been better at the unconventional tracks like New Hampshire, Pocono, and Watkins Glen. A longer shot pick to me after recent runs is Ricky Stenhouse Jr. Ricky finished 3rd at the first race this time, and he's always been pretty good at Bristol. Maybe this could be the race where Ricky Stenhouse gets into the playoffs. Another guy I can see doing pretty well at this race is Eric Jones. Eric Jones is in those Joe Gibbs cars, and last season when he was in the 77 for Furniture Row Racing, he almost got his first career win. Maybe this time around, having pretty much the same equipment as Kyle Busch, he can outduel him and get his win at the Bristol night race. Now, someone I could potentially see running pretty well and maybe getting his first career win, this is the longest of long shots that I could possibly think of, is Darrell Wallace Jr. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. He's in a Richard Petty car, they're not that good, you're crazy. But at the first race at Bristol, he went up and took the lead and led multiple laps. And then they screwed up on the setup and he ended up finishing about 16th. And just maybe, if Darrell Wallace Jr. can figure out the setup for this car, he could be the one in victory lane. Now on to number 3. Will Tempers flare? Going into this weekend's race at Bristol, in the promotional material for this race, you'll see a bunch of tempers flaring where people are fighting, throwing helmets, hitting people, throwing stuff at cars, etc. One of the things I'm surprised people don't show more in the promotional material is Kevin Harvick jumping over Greg Biffle's car and attacking him after the Busch race. Now we know going into this race, whether a car gets bumped, nudged, just slides a little bit, anything that slightly looks like someone else did it to him, the announcer is going to play up, oh, short track, short tempers, here we go. But going into this race, I could see some people maybe flaring up and going at it with the playoffs being so close. And this being one of those races, it's kind of like a mini super speedway race where maybe anyone could win because aero won't be playing such a huge role at the short track. And with so many guys who haven't won this season, such as Denny Hamlin, Brad Keselowski, and Kurt Busch, who we've all seen get into it in the past with other drivers, and maybe if one of them has a really good car and they get stuck near like 10th or and they're trying to make a run and someone will get out of their way, then maybe they dump them and then there's a fracas after this race. So that'll do it for this edition of 3 Wide. Leave your thoughts about the upcoming race at Bristol and what you thought about Michigan in the comment section below, and if you liked what you saw, hit the subscribe button. And as always, thanks for watching.